Good evening, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I don't know, it depends from the part of the world you are connecting with us today. We will start this third webinar, this ISCEAH webinar with words of our president, Magdalena Kenza. We cannot hear you, Magda. You were mute.
Yes, that's right. I'm sorry I couldn't find the window anymore. Yes, I joined the greetings from Amanda. We are always many people connecting from every corner of the world. So greetings, whatever sunlight or moonlight you have. I'm Maddalena Kenza, and I'm president of this committee. As you know, ISCEAH is one of ICOMOS 31 scientific committees, and it's the one dedicated to earthen architectural heritage. Our committee is composed at the moment of almost 150 members, of course, from all over the world, and the committee itself is organized in 5 working groups, which are seismic, technology, archaeology, in-use, heritage, and landscapes. Each of these groups is coordinated by an expert member, and at present the coordinators are Natalia Jorquera for the working group focusing on seismic, Ayan Stigler for in-use heritage, Paconirina Rako Tomamonji for technology, Masoud Nakhaei for archaeology, and Jorge Tomasi for landscapes. The seminar that we are attending today is the third of 5 appointments, each one dedicated to the focus of one of the chair themes. And these meetings are organized to meet 2 goals. The first goal is to present and to disseminate the work of the scientific committee by informing about the work that's carried out by the 5 working groups. And the second goal, which I care much about, is to help our younger members to work together with us older ones and allow them to actually enrich the committee with new ideas and with fresh energy. This is also the reason why each seminar is managed together by the chair coordinator and an ICOMOS emerging professional who is actually active in the same topic. So we heard already Elena De Santis for seismic and Julieta Barada for technology. We will share the work of Alison Cavicchio today for archaeology. And next, we will hear Tininan Bashir Sherif, who is also the coordinator of the EP group. And she will be participating in the seminar dedicated for in-use heritage. And finally, Elisa Berry for landscape. So I don't take any more time. I leave the place to Masoud and Alison. And I take this chance anyway to thank all coordinators and emerging professionals who organized these 5 meetings, and hope that all participants will enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. So we welcome Masoud Nakhaei. He is the EP representative, the coordinator of the archaeology team. He is a PhD candidate studying earth science at the University of Roma Tre in Rome, Italy. He has been actively involved in conservation, restoration, and consultancy activities at UNESCO World Heritage sites, such as the Tchogha Zanbil, Pasargadae, and Persepolis from 2009. Currently, he is the focal point of ISCEAH ICOMOS Climate Change Working Group. Besides conservation of World Heritage sites, his research focuses on disaster risk management, climate change, and adaptation of heritage archaeology sites. Thank you, Masoud, for being today. I will start sharing so you can...
You're welcome. Greeting to everyone. So let's share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay. So my name is Masoud Nakhaei. I'm a chair of archaeology, and today I'm going to talk about the goals and activities of the ISCEAH Archaeology Subcommittee. So by looking at these two pictures, the first question that comes to our mind is, how are these earthen structures turned to the ruins over the passage of time? Is somebody having the answer for this question? You can think about it, and when at the end of the presentation, we can talk about it more. So we know that the earthen structures were subjected to different hazards all over the time, but how some of these vulnerable structures could survive for centuries and how they destroyed. Conservation of earthen archaeological sites is one of the controversial issues between earthen heritage practitioners due to its vulnerability to different factors. The various components has contributed to the damage to these sites, causing loss of their value, ranging from different weather conditions, inherent vulnerability of earthen materials, and more importantly, man-made hazards. It has been observed that even under normal circumstances, inappropriate interventions and unprofessional treatment have affected the integrity of earthen heritage. For answering the first question, we need to know that the most vital part of earthen construction is directly related to the knowledge of traditional architects or professional masters in dealing with earth and their perceived of different risks. Their experience in recognizing ready-to-use mud, adobe preparation, and application methods is entirely based on their tacit knowledge and practical experiences. Their experience over the years, along with the different environmental conditions, has provided the base for creativity, the use of indigenous capacities and best practices, which can be considered as a practical factor in today's challenges. Therefore, traditional knowledge of local and indigenous people is increasingly recognized as an important source for the conservation of earthen heritage, and it could be introduced as one of the low-cost strategies in the long-term sustainable conservation of earthen heritage against different hazards. But the transfer of this traditional knowledge has always taken place through the traditional master pupil system. And the biggest weakness of this system was the, if we can say weakness, was the lack of documenting and recording this information and verbal transfer of knowledge to each other. Forgetting traditional knowledge of earthen heritage due to various factors such as modern materials and new challenges, you name it, leads to abandonment of earthen cities. Maintenance of earthen building in the absence of documented traditional knowledge or even professional masters is getting more difficult, the main challenge we are facing in the earthen heritage sites. While documenting the traditional knowledge and collecting past experiences can shed the light on conservation strategies, because the knowledge of the past generation was not simply copied, but was also associated with the innovation based on climatic, social, and economic factors. Concerning a documentation gap of earthen heritage deterioration patterns, as well as traditional knowledge and modern techniques, providing a database of different techniques for reducing the vulnerability and maintenance of earthen heritage is proposed as an essential effort by this subcommittee. So with this introduction, I'm going to talk about the role of ISCEAH in dealing with these challenges. The primary purpose of the ISCEAH Archaeology Subcommittee is a study of earthen archaeological environment, which may also include a standing structure. For this purpose, the Archaeological Committee conducts relevant studies over the course of every 3 years. Throughout these 3 years plans, all members of the committee from around the world are invited to collaborate in these studies. For example, during the last years, the archaeology subcommittee of ISCEAH has developed an important glossary for earth and heritage deterioration patterns, which is presently under the final revision, and we will disseminate the glossary by translating it into different languages. Moreover, the purpose of the triennial plan is to assist in development and implementation of overall scientific development strategy for ICOMOS. ICOMOS Scientific Council has set up a scientific program of interdisciplinary dams seeking collaboration from all ISCS. Within that framework, ISCEAH Archaeology Subcommittee can contribute through training, field project, organization of conferences and seminars, publications, research, websites, methods for response to requests for assistance, and etc. For this purpose, in the last 3 years, we have been actually collecting traditional and modern knowledge of the conservation of earth and architecture. As you may know, conservation is an ongoing cyclical process, and understanding the current condition of conservation techniques is an essential first step to good conservation practice. This database could provide a useful resource for the conservation of archaeology sites and in various topics such as methodology, material modification, climate change adaptation, conservation, and restoration. And actually, in some cases, traditional techniques alone are not able to protect the earth and heritage, obviously, and it is necessary to collect and evaluate modern conservation methods and applied modern techniques and the strategies in different parts of the world can act as a useful source to deal with the hazards, vulnerability, and when traditional knowledge cannot meet our needs. At present, it is necessary to collect various conservation techniques, including traditional and modern techniques that have been done in different parts of the world, and to complete the purposeful studies of ISCEAH with the aim of conservation of our valuable earthen heritage. The database of traditional and modern knowledge and techniques of earthen heritage could be useful in different studies, and identifying the most appropriate methods will also prevent common and ongoing mistakes in the conservation of earthen archaeological sites. In the end, evaluation of the strength and weakness of these collecting methods could also help to progress the Earth and Heritage Charter and climate change action, as well as evaluating the current state of the Earth and Heritage conservation. So that's it from me. Over to you, Alison. And we can have a question and answer at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masoud, for your presentation. And yes, we will let the questions for the end of the session. And now we invite Alison for her presentation. I will present you first. So Alison or Ali is an architectural conservator at the MTFA Design and Preservation in Washington, D.C., with a MS in Historic Preservation from the University of Pennsylvania. Her research examined the practice of earthen shutter coating applied as a method of preventive conservation to exposed adobe walls at archaeological sites. Ali also worked on earthen conservation projects at Pecos National Historical Park and at the Fort Union National Monument in New Mexico, and has worked as a conservator for a variety of clients. She is a member of American Institute for Conservation and the Association of Preservation Technology. She's a member also of the US ICOMOS-CCHWG and ISCEAH EP working group. So Alison, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Okay, let me share my screen. Oops. Sorry, I will not happened. Can you guys see my screen now?
Not yet.
Okay,
Yes.
there we go.
Yes. We can see your screen.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Alison Cavicchio. Thank you so much for being here. As Nakhaei said, my research evaluated shelter coating as a preventive conservation method for earthen sites. I'll just start off quickly with my research statement. I'll take you through some key terms, and I'll walk you through my research, including the history and practice of shelter coating, which ultimately informed my testing program. My research examined shelter coating applied as a method of preventive conservation to exposed adobe walls at archaeological or otherwise uninhabited heritage sites, with Fort Union National Monument serving as the case study. Formulas and application methods for shelter coats can vary, but ultimately their performance should satisfy critical optimal properties. So my research identified performance parameters for earthen shelter coats and tested their efficacy in a series of lab-based simulations that are designed to characterize the soil and then subject it to a series of performance tests. So earthen ruins, as we know, deteriorate rapidly when they're left unprotected. When contemporary adobe structures are in use, they're typically plastered using gypsum or lime that's anchored into the wall. But as ruins, the use of these renders isn't appropriate as the structures are missing critical elements of protection, such as roofs, foundations, stable wall elevations. When mud plaster is used on earthen structures that are in use, it's actively maintained by the community who erected and uses the site, typically with traditional methods, such as in the bottom two images. So shelter coating is a global practice of applying a mud layer to exposed earthen sites, and it's one form of protection that serves to reduce surface erosion. And it diverges from the practice of mud plastering as a distinct form of preventive conservation that was developed as a response to the problem of protecting earthen ruins. So as I mentioned, shelter coating is carried out by applying a mud layer of similar composition to the adobe or mud bricks. And as we'll see later on, the composition and granulometry of the soil are really critical. Typically the local soils are more compatible with the substrate if mud bricks were made locally, as is traditional. And the shelter coat consists of two layers, the unamended mud layer and an amended mud layer that includes a stabilizer to enhance the exterior layer's resistance to water. So if the shelter coat is working as it should, in the case of weather, natural events, the shelter coat will erode rather than the adobe. So it's sacrificial, but with the correct formula and application technique, the shelter coat should last longer and resist spall to help sites in situ with minimal loss of original fabric. One of the biggest challenges in my research early on was this myriad of different terms referring to mud or plaster coatings. And the term shelter coat is referred to really infrequently in the literature. There are many different terms used to describe a shelter coat, including mud plaster, render, even mortar. So there's kind of these terms being tossed around. So part of my research process deconstructed those and unraveled the terms. And as I mentioned, there's really limited research on this method, despite its widespread use globally. There's been more testing done on clay grouts and earthen mortars. So I was able to adapt much of that lab testing to inform my own. So shelter coating is just one practice among a variety of other preventive conservation methods that are used at earthen sites. You can see a few of those here. Some of these are more invasive than others and might have long-term impact for conservation and interpretation at the site. So shelter coating ultimately allows the site, if it's appropriate at a site, it can allow it to be protected while maintaining important visual aesthetics, and it also allows visitors to see the form of the remaining structure. At a site like Fort Union, you'll see the kind of layout of it in a second. The use of a large shelter structure like the one at Casa Grande in Arizona that you can see here would significantly impact visitor experience and the cultural landscape surrounding the ruins. So it wouldn't be an appropriate choice at Fort Union. Shelter coats are also generally reversible, which is a key consideration as we make strides to better link practice and theory in earthen conservation efforts. So concerning my literature and research, it really consisted of 3 categories. I looked at conservation approaches and theory to understand concepts that apply to earthen heritage sites and why one might be taken over another, as we just saw. And as I mentioned, there's really little literature dedicated exclusively to shelter coating, but there is a huge amount of information about material properties of adobe that can inform our understanding of shelter coats, which share similar composition. And finally, I reviewed a history of surface treatments used on adobes, including shelter coats. So just really some quick history. Fort Union National Monument is located in New Mexico in the southwestern United States, and it was established in 1851 to protect settlers traveling along the Santa Fe Trail. The fort was abandoned in 1891, and it was left to the elements, left to looters, tourists, to just run around in for 63 years until it was established as a national monument in 1954. And it's now maintained by the National Park Service. So the Park Service has used iterations of protective coatings and tested them at Fort Union from 1956 to present. There were some initial structural stabilization efforts that were carried out that you can see here, followed by a range of synthetic resins applied directly to the original adobe. So there's a long history of use of various products at Fort Union. And Roplex E330 is an acrylic emulsion that Fort Union is currently using. It began being tested in 1973 at another site in the southwestern US. And it was the most successful emulsion that was used on the adobes. So word spread throughout the Southwest about this product being great, but the original recommendations for its use in soils were not always implemented when using the product. So regarding, just another quick note regarding shelter coat testing, there was a project conducted in the 1990s at another site in New Mexico, and it recommended further research into chemical products like Roplex and their application. But since then, up until my research, there's been almost no research, no testing done on shelter coating on historic adobe. So aside from informal changes made in the field, there hasn't been any testing until now. So currently Fort Union uses this following mix. It includes Roplex E330 diluted in water to create a 14% solution, and then they mix that with the soil before applying it. So shelter coating should satisfy these optimal properties to resist fall from weather events. Good consistency or plasticity is particularly important, and the shelter coat should display low shrinkage to minimize cracks that allow water infiltration, in addition to the other properties listed here. And a strong shelter coat can be really important for earthen sites that employ this practice. On the left, you can see these severe examples of deterioration at a site in Turkmenistan that was left unprotected. The first step in my confirmatory tests on the soil in the lab at Penn was characterizing the soil, and understanding the compatibility of materials is really critical in earthen heritage. As we know, the soil structure can vary from site to site, and lack of knowledge about earthen architecture and materials being used is the major reason for failure at earthen sites. So currently Fort Union is using a red soil from another region of New Mexico, and they were previously using a brown soil from the area that was closer to the site. And in talking with staff during some of my site visits, they said that they thought that the brown soil seemed to have a better consistency, but no testing had ever been done on site or in the lab to confirm that. And they're adding they're adding sand to both of the soils when they use them on site. So moving forward, I needed to determine which soil performed the best, the red or the brown, without any amendments or additions. And so I had these confirmatory tests that I carried out. The Atterberg limits tests are an important indication of soil performance and consistency. So for those of you who don't know, the liquid limit test measures the water content at which a soil begins to behave as a liquid. So the brown soil had a high liquid limit, meaning that it was able to absorb a higher amount of water before turning into a liquid state. And then even with the addition of sand, the brown soil had a slightly lower liquid limit, but still performed plastically. And the red soil's liquid limit could not be determined. Okay. And so the liquid limit, plastic limit ultimately informed the plasticity index. The plasticity index is the range at which the soil's water content allows it to behave plastically or as a workable soil. So the red soil ultimately proved to have a poor consistency. It was not plastic, not cohesive. The addition of sand lowered the brown soil's plasticity index overall, but ultimately was still able to perform using at Fort Union. I'll have to go back to this slide for people who listening.
Sorry, Alison, Ali, for that.
That's okay. Okay. So the shrinkage test was the next performance test that I carried out. Low shrinkage is one of the optimal properties required for earthen shelter coats to minimize water infiltration. So ultimately you want the soil to display low shrinkage on its own without any amendments. Since Fort Union is using, as I mentioned, the soil and sand mix that performed well, I needed to test that performance here between the raw soil and the soil with the addition of sand. The brown soil with the sand ultimately displayed less shrinkage, confirming that the sand improved the soil's resistance to shrinkage upon drying. And then I moved on with the soil and sand formulation. And since Fort Union is using a 14% Roplex solution at the site, I tested that. And I also halved that amount and used a 7% solution in the lab. So that informed the 3 different formulations of shelter coat that I used. And the consistency test that you see here on the bottom screen is ultimately a quantitative measure of the soil's consistency. So if shelter coats are too wet, they might shrink excessively. And if they're too dry and not workable, they won't adhere to the substrate. Ultimately, Roplex reduced the workability of shelter coat formulations. The next test was water absorption. And so this is a test of water repellency from the surface. It measures the absorption rate of 1 drop of water and the subsequent desorption rate of that drop. So you want a low absorption rate, meaning high water repellency, but you also need high desorption rates, meaning faster drying. So ultimately, the 7 and 14% displayed high water repellency, but low desorption rates, which is not ideal because we want the shelter coat to dry out more quickly. finally, the last test that I conducted was the water drop test. This was developed by Crater, and it measures the resistance of an earthen substrate to erosion when exposed to the impact of falling water. And you can see the test setup on the left there, the makeshift lab setup. So to measure the precise depth of erosion on each sample of shelter coat, an approach was adopted using glass microbeads. You can see on the right, the greater the weight or the volume of the beads filling the hole in each shelter coat signified a higher depth of erosion. So ultimately, the higher amounts of Roplax resulted in a reduction of the depth of erosion on the sample. So I want to just kind of quickly go back to Masoud's point in the beginning, talking about traditional building materials and methods. So mud, plaster, and shelter coating itself was not used at traditionally at Fort Union, but the results of my research found that the local soil performed better than the soil from a different region in New Mexico. So the point really is that local soils used as mud plaster are typically more compatible with the earthen substrate. And when thinking about using any modern amendments like Roplax or others in combination with traditional methods or materials, the testing of the amendment is really critical because the soil type affects the success of Roplax's performance. So it might perform well on one soil compared to another. So ultimately, we again want these optimal properties for the shelter coat. The addition of Roplax decreased the plasticity of the shelter coat, and ultimately it did not impact its overall shrinkage in the soil. But the performance tests conducted revealed that a higher percentage of Roplax at 14% had greater resistance to erosion, but displayed a lower consistency or workability and also lower desorption rates. So previous research suggested that a sandier soil performed best with Roplax. Even with the addition of sand at Fort Union to the brown soil, it did not meet these minimum suggestions and the minimum percentages. But the brown soil also performed much better than the red soil that they are using currently. So one of my immediate suggestions for the site was to revert to the use of brown soil or soil of similar composition and increase the percentage of fine sand, assuming that they're going to continue using Roplax for the time being. And then regarding percentages of Roplax, field testing really is critical and is needed before any changes are considered at the site. So there's a lot more research that can be done on shelter coating, and I believe there's a young woman at Penn now who's kind of continuing this research, so that's exciting. But yeah, continued and long-term testing and research is really needed both in the field and the laboratory to confirm site-specific soils and confirm the effects they're having with varying percentages of Roplax. And regarding the use of synthetic resins like Roplax, their impact on the environment is something that hasn't been studied at all. And at most of the sites in the Southwest, and I'm sure it's similar globally, they're just being disposed of at the site. So the microplastics from the synthetic resins are seeping into the soil and probably contaminating the environment, but there's been no research on this. And then another interesting area, I think, of future research could be different application methods. So at Fort Union, they're using rubber gloves to apply the shelter coating. There's thinking that perhaps there would be better adhesion if you're using just your hand or like a natural glove, like a sheepskin. Other sites use a trowel or a brush. Frank Matero, who was my advisor on this, had a fun thought to try to use a pressurized spray nozzle to spray a shelter coat onto a wall. So that could be an interesting area to research. So there's a lot to be done. So it's exciting. And then finally, the use of linseed oil or other organic additives had been tested back in the 1990s at Fort Selden, but they described these as performing really poorly as an unamended soil. So significant research really needs to be done on organic additives before they can be used on site. So again, there's a lot to be explored and to be researched. So I'm excited to see what the future of shelter coating brings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. And we are excited also to see your future next research. And thank you a lot for this deep and detailed presentation. I don't know, Madalena, do you have comments or something to say?
Yes, I actually have a question because I was wondering, I have two questions actually, if I can. And if I don't take too much time. I was wondering if you're testing also natural stabilizers or just synthetic? Alison.
I only tested synthetic. I would have loved to have included some organic amendments, but just the time constraints, I was doing this in a year. I had to limit it to just a couple different formulations. But that's an exciting area to look into too.
Indeed, yes. And the other question is, I was wondering if anybody that, as far as you know, is doing any study on the state of old interventions. I ask you this because I just saw the work that Giacomo Chiari made in Tel Omar in Iraq in the 70s, I think. And it's an excellent work, and it still keeps in an excellent way. I think it's one of those examples that you named before, made with, I'm not expert in the field, but I think you named methyl methacrylate and ethylene glycol, whatever. I think this is what he used, but as we have good examples made many, many years ago, we should maybe consider these good results and eventually, again, start from there.
Yeah, I haven't seen his research, but that's really interesting. And yeah, I mean, one of the things that I found looking back at the last testing specifically on shelter coating was that there were certain recommendations for the percentages of, sand and within the soil that had been recommended, but they weren't being practiced. So there's a lot, I think, that we can probably take from previous research and field work.
May I ask a question, Alison, actually?
Sure.
The question is about the shelter coating. In the past, they didn't protect and cover their structure, adobe structures with the plaster.
At Fort Union?
Yes.
No, yeah. So this site previously was plastered with, or there was a lime plaster over
lime with
yeah.
The final plaster was lime without soil or earthen plaster.
Yeah.
And then you apply the mud plaster at the wall. Yes, true.
Yeah. So the lime plaster at Fort Union there's a few patches of it left, but for the most part it's gone because this site is, just crumbling popsicles of adobe brick left at the site. So that's why they're using mud plaster or shelter coating there rather than a lime plaster. Again, the site won't support lime plaster there.
And I realized that in some of your picture, you didn't add a straw on the soil. And yes?
The
straw.
Oh, yeah, no, we didn't.
Without a straw. And this soil was really good because, you know, with the cracks that will happen after the plastering, and when the soil will be dry, it becomes some crack. But without the straw, it would be very interesting that soil is very.
Yeah,
thank you.
I have a couple of comments.
Yeah, Claudia, okay, go ahead. But please, I just would like to remember you that we have the annual meeting after like 15 minutes. So
yeah,
please,
no, just two things. The first one is something that Madalena said that I think is very interesting, is the evaluation of past treatments. I mean, I think the GCI many years ago tried to embark into this type of study, and the problem with that is that there is no enough documentation from the treatment at the moment that it was performed, and there hasn't been any monitoring, scientific monitoring, or at least some data about like how to compare how it performed. So there is no standardized way to compare before and after. If there is a way to get some examples that have enough documentation besides photographs, because photographs is not really that, you did scientific. I mean, I think that would be a really good idea. But I think it's very hard to find treatments that were done in the past they actually have in mind to monitor them in the future. And then the other thing that I was going to say about the straw is that, particularly for capping, it's very complicated to add a straw to the mud, just because, because of the workability and the application of the material can be complicated. So I think most of the time is without the straw, particularly for the testing. So those are the two things I just wanted to add. Thank you.
Claudia, we have a comment also on the chat. So Sarah Faden asked, she says, or he, I'm sorry, I don't know. Based on your experience so far, can you state how long a good shelter coat can last on these structures at earthen sites, perhaps with reference to soil composition and perhaps climate change related issues?
Yeah, I mean, climate change is one of the biggest threats, and at Fort Union, there's been more severe fall, at least there hasn't been a specific study on this, but just in kind of monitoring over the last 5 to 10 years, the site managers have definitely noticed an increase in the shelter coatings falling off. They're reapplying, not fully reapplying, but they're patching the shelter coating every year. I think ideally it would last longer than that. I mean, it's still a sacrificial element, so it's hard to say. I don't know if I have a good, I think it just depends on the site, and you need to test the soil, with amendments before you're using it. I think that with more testing at Fort Union and with the use of the different soil there, they could potentially have longer periods of time between applications.
Okay, and we have another question in the question and answer box about the glossary. So Cynthia asked if the glossary of deterioration will be published. Maybe Masoud, you want to say something about this?
Yes, of course. The glossary of the earthen material deterioration patterns will be published soon, hopefully the beginning of the next year. we will translate it into different languages, mostly English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Persian, different languages. And in the beginning, spring of the 2024, hopefully.
Perfect. Great. I think, well, thank you very much, Alison and Masoud, for this very interesting evening. And
You're welcome.
I think, well, all the people that participated were very enthusiastic about it. So we invite you all for our next webinar, and we will be sending the information through our networks, and we hope to see you. Pamela is wants to say something. Pamela, yes, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to, I sent actually a note to Susanna because we don't have her proper email address, but I don't know if she read the note or not. So before we hang up, Susanna, can you please email one of us with your correct email address? Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Great. Just direct, easier. Perfect. So I hope we can see you all the 22nd of November, when we will be gathering together in the In-Use Earth and Architectural webinar with Ayon Stegler and Tin Hinane Bachit-Cherif. So thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you for your participation. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.